Welcome to this mini lecture on variables. We will be circling back to variables quite a bit throughout this year, but here are some general terms, ideas, and how to get started thinking about the variables related to your research. So there are four basic types of data that you're probably familiar with. You have nominal data, which is used for labeling variables like a name, gender, hair color, eye color. You may have ordinal level data, which is a scale where the order of the value is important, but the distance between the values is unknown. For the example, a difference between strongly agree from somewhat agree. An example of ordinal data is satisfaction scales. So next is interval level data. Interval level data, they have an order with an exact difference between the values. So to easily remember it, think space between. An example would be temperature. Finally, ratio. Ratio scales have exact difference between values, like interval level, but they have also an absolute zero. For example, height, weight, and time have absolute zeros where there is no negative. Depression. You can have depression or there can be no depression. So there's a zero scale. So ratio level scales are usually ones that we use in mental health. These are important because the questions we ask, the type of data we collect, and how we measure the data is extremely important. For example, age is a ratio data, but put into age ranges, now we have nominal level data. So the statistics that can be collected for these two different types of data are vastly different. We can get into that later, but for the nominal level data, we can only count the frequency and the mode, and therefore we can only provide descriptive statistics. For ratio level data, we can run inferential statistics that we may need for causal, comparative, or correlational analysis. So the higher the level of measure, the more interesting your study, and the easier it will be for you to run statistics. So a control variable is one that does not change and is kept the same throughout your research. So an independent variable is the one that you purposely change or test. So this might include a treatment or an intervention that you give to an experimental group, or it could be a predictive variable that has causal relationship to a dependent variable. The dependent variable on the other hand, is the variable that will be measured to see if the independent variable impacted it. For example, if I normally fall asleep at 10:30, however, I introduce a treatment/predictive measure of drinking a cup of caffeinated coffee at 3 o'clock, which my coffee is the independent variable, I will measure the time I fall asleep, the dependent variable. My hypothesis is that I will not be able to easily fall asleep until 11 because of the caffeine's, the independent variables, impact on my body. So determining the variables that you will use is something that takes some consideration. Our mind often thinks in terms of cause and effect, but then we try to label it, and it often gets turned around in our head. So the definition of the control, independent, and dependent variables will be described in the last slide. However, for those visual learners, here's a picture that have helped me think about the difference between independent and dependent variable. I also hope that you will find them helpful as well. Quantitative designs. So over the course of the semester, we will primarily be describing and teaching you how to conduct research within these three quantitative designs: descriptive design and causal comparative, also called experimental designs, and a correlation. We will also learn about other designs as we go in the textbook that has great emphasis on various qualitative and mixed methods regardless. Here we go. When thinking about determining the variables that you will want to collect, take a minute to reflect on what you're studying. If you're conducting a needs assessment, a program evaluation, a client satisfaction, or something similar, the variables that you will gather most likely will be descriptive rather than inferential in nature. Meaning you cannot use a t-test or Pearson R-test with the results because they are nominal or ordinal in nature. If, for example, I am examining the frequency in which individuals utilize a particular service, I might be counting the times that clients come into the office per week. I may want to diversify my client population and examine the percentages of men and women, the various race and ethnic groups, and examine age brackets. These are all examples of descriptive variables. If I'm wanting to conduct a treatment intervention analysis and have an experimental group, a group that will be given a treatment, and a control group, a group that will not be given the treatment, then I have a comparative study. I'm comparing two groups. To measure the difference between the two groups, I will need an instrument that measures the social component that I'm looking to change. I might use a depression scale, a self-efficacy scale, or the list goes on, whatever kind of instrument that you can find. If I want to study the impact of walking with a client during a session as a means of lowering depression, I could measure 10 people in each group's depression scores before and after the treatment, then run a t-test to determine the significance of the difference. If I have noticed that many of my clients have a common problem, and those that share it in intensity have similar backgrounds, I might examine the relationship between a variable and the outcome that I'm seeing. For example, if I'm working with individuals who have persistent and fairly constant suicidal ideation, I might notice that those with the greatest intensity of suicidal ideation have been close to a family member who had completed suicide when they were a child. I could ask the adult and the close family member, I could ask whether the adult had a close family member die to suicide when they were a child and at what age. I could then assess their level of hopelessness through the Beck's hopelessness scale, an instrument that measures the level of motivation to live. And I could use a Pearson R to determine the level and strength of the relationship between age and the hopelessness scale, because those two variables are interval and ratio level data. We'll go over this again in much more detail with examples and diagrams, but I wanted to give you a quick look down the path so that you can begin to plan your variables and with these designs in mind. So now that you have some background on the types of variables, how they might fit within your quantitative research design, it's time to write some variables down, and this list might change, but it will begin the process. So start by thinking about the population that you want to sample. What demographic information are you interested in learning about them? Write all that you might consider. Is it easier to take things off your list than add them later? So next, if you're hoping to conduct a comparison or correlation study, have you found an instrument to use? A great place to look is in the journal articles that you've read for your Lit Review section. If none are there, try using Google Scholar to search for them. So put an instrument with keywords from the dependent or impact that you're trying to measure. For example, depression, social capital, hopelessness, anxiety, resilience, ACEs, burnout, and add in the word scales. So use your variables and add in the word scale and that, or instrument. Sometimes you can put the word measurement in there too. So what general topics does your instrument cover, and are there any subcategories? So looking at the instruments, finding out what do they measure, and then getting back to your list of variables. Next, the next step is to dream outside the box. What do you want to know about that isn't on an instrument that you're familiar with, but you want to study and write it down? So you will include these on your research proposal sketch number 2, I believe. So here is a visual recap. Have your topic in mind. List your demographic variables. Consider the design that you might use. Then list out additional variables. Start to note whether they are descriptive, they're control variables, independent or dependent variables, and I will look forward to reading what you have come up with.